We're going to spend this morning talking specifically about the fruit of the Spirit. And over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about each of those different fruits of the Spirit and go deeply into what it means to be a Christian. Someone in my position as pastor often gets questions that sound something like this. How can I know if I'm a Christian? In fact, one young guy who was a senior in high school came into my office when I was doing youth ministry, and he said, "Is there such a thing as a Christianometer? Because I need one." And I said, "Yes, there is a Christianometer," and I read him this Galatians 5 passage. It's a measure of our faithfulness. The problem is we can't go out and try to do these things because it doesn't work that way. So let's look and see how it works and see what Paul has to tell us about this Christian lifestyle. He begins off the passage with this. My counsel is this, he says. Now, I don't know about you, but anytime a mentor of mine has said to me, "I have some important information for you," I usually listen. And anytime the Bible says, "I have some important counsel for you," it's always a good idea to pay attention. My counsel is this: live freely, animated and motivated by God's Spirit, then you won't feed off the compulsions of selfishness. There are three things that Paul tells us that we need to get. Three things we need to get in order to get our lives started in the right direction. First, we need to get released. We need to get released. He says, live freely. The problem with religion is it tends to chain us up. It tends to make us prisoners of all of the rules that we have to follow. But Christianity isn't about rules. It's about freedom. Paul tells us we need to live freely. We need to get released. The problem with most folks is they think the Bible is a book full of shalt nots. The Bible's full of a whole lot more shalls than it is shalt nots. There's a whole lot more do's than don'ts in there. And if we're focusing all the don'ts and the shall nots, we're not going to discover the freedom that comes from our faith. If you know an individual who has converted from Islam or from Buddhism or something to Christianity, one of the things that they will say to you when you ask them about their new faith, they will say, "I've never felt such freedom." Christianity is about freedom. Every once in a while, there'll be a very intelligent atheist person who will come up to me and say, "Well, if you're a Christian, how come you don't wear tassels on your shoulders and do all those other things like it says you're supposed to do in Leviticus?" And I say, well, Christianity is not about rules or laws. God sent His Son with a new covenant. It's not about living these laws anymore. It's about living the freedom that comes from God's love. Too many churches say you got to not drink or smoke or chew or dance with girls that do. They missed the boat. It's about freedom. We need to get released, Paul says. And once we get released, then we need to get active. He says, live freely, animated. I just spent the last 2 days walking around Disney World, and it's amazing what that animation can do. That mouse can get into your wallet quicker than you could ever imagine. But we need to be animated. The difference between Mickey Mouse cartoons and the funnies in the paper is Mickey Mouse is animated. He's moving around. He's doing something. We need to get animated in our faith. It's not about just sitting around and being spiritual. It's about a lifestyle. It's about doing something. It's about getting off our pew and going out and being somebody. We need to get released, and then we need to get active, and finally, Paul says we need to get filled. Live freely and animated and motivated by God's Spirit. When we accept Christ into our life, God's Spirit fills us. In the Bible study on Wednesday night, we're talking about King David who was called the man after God's own heart. And when the prophet Samuel comes and anoints David to be the new king, it says he was filled with God's Spirit. In the same way, when we accept Christ into our lives, like happened in that early church in the 2nd chapter of Acts, God's Spirit fills our lives and we become different. We're filled. If you came to church this morning and you were feeling kind of cranky and grouchy because the neighborhood kids are making a lot of noise and life just is terrible, then you have a God-sized hole inside of you. And the Spirit of God is what can fill that. It's not on the slide, but it's in your outline. The most important word in this scripture is choose. Paul says, why don't you choose to be led by the Spirit and so escape the erratic compulsions? It's a choice. God will never force himself on you. You have to choose how you want to respond. And then Paul talks about 2 different choices. The first choice he talks about is a bad choice. He tells us what the results of a bad choice, or I think more appropriately, a selfish choice is. He says it's obvious what kind of life develops out of trying to get your own way all the time. If we make a bad or a selfish choice, bad things are going to happen. 2 of them. 1, we get to pick our failure. There's a whole list of them there. I'm not going to read them all because we all know every single one of them. And I imagine that, like me, there's one in that list that's your favorite failure and you choose it all the time. We all struggle with it. But that's not what our faith is about. Our faith is about making good choices, but when we make a bad choice or a selfish choice, we get to pick our failure and we pick our future. Because your actions form your future. And if we're making bad choices all the time, we're going to have a bad future. We're going to be in trouble all the time. We're going to have folks not like us all the time. We're going to just be messed up. If we pick a failure, we will also pick a failing future. If you use your freedom in this way, Paul says, you will not inherit God's kingdom. But there's another choice that we can make. As opposed to making a bad or a selfish choice, we can make a good choice or a God choice. But what happens when we live God's way, Paul asks us? He brings gifts into our lives, much the same way fruit appears in an orchard. Now, if you hear this sermon today and you say, I really like them fruit of the Spirit things, I'm going to go out of here and I'm going to work on every one of them fruits of the Spirit. I'm going to be peaceful and patient and joyful and loving and all them things, and you're going to get about halfway to the car before that stops working. And once you drive out of here and drive around town, the joy and the patience thing is going to go right out of the window, because I drive in this town all the time and it's not fun. You can't make those things happen in your life. You can't work on those things. They're gifts. Have you ever been to an apple orchard? The trees aren't out in the orchard going, trying to push the apples out. They just happen. Apples are a natural result of being an apple tree. In the same way, you can't force these spiritual gifts, these fruits of the Spirit, out of your life. They just happen from making good choices, making the God choice. Just like the apple tree, it's something that happens naturally. If you're a Christian and you're doing your best to live a faithful life, these fruits of the Spirit just happen naturally. When you make a God choice, first you receive your gift. You receive your gifts. Paul writes in the NIV translation, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. If you're living a faithful life, trying your best to express God's love, you'll discover that you're a more joyful person, that you're a more peaceful and patient person, that you start becoming more kind. You start exhibiting more self-control naturally, not because you've been working on these things or you went to a special class, but just because that's God's fruit growing in you. These are gifts from God. You can't make them happen. Faithfulness is kind of like fertilizer. The fertilizer doesn't make the apples. The apples just happen naturally, but boy, the trees use that fertilizer to make more apples happen. Being a faithful person fertilizes our Christianity and makes these different fruits appear more naturally from us. When we make a God choice, we receive our gifts and then we receive our calling. Paul says, don't just hold it as an idea in our heads or a sentiment in our hearts, but work out its implications in every detail of our lives. This faith is not something that monks do in mountains far away. It's an active thing. We need to figure out what God is calling us to do, and then we'll experience those gifts of the Spirit. Now, I'm going to embarrass him a little bit, but I have an individual in our church who is expressing one of these fruits of the Spirit. Y'all know Wayne. Wayne's about 139 years old. Almost. But Wayne is doing his darndest to be a faithful person, and his faithfulness is amazing. He is here every morning to open up that office. He gets here before everybody gets here, opens the door and makes sure the air conditioning's on and that everybody's taken care of. He comes over and opens the door for you. Now, is Wayne a perfect Christian? No. But he's working on it. And he knows his calling. His calling is to be a faithful servant of this church. Now, I don't know what God is calling you to do, but I know He's calling you to do something. And I know that once you figure out what your calling is and you begin doing it faithfully, you'll start experiencing all of these fruits of the Spirit in your life. The last verse in that chapter says, we have far more interesting things to do with our lives. Each of us is an original. Be an original. Figure out what it is that God is calling you to do and do it and be an original. I'll give you an example. I did my first pastoral call in Reno, Nevada at St. John's Presbyterian Church. Now, if you've never been to Reno, the main drag that runs from the casinos right down the middle of town all the way north and south is called Virginia Street. And you can get to just about anywhere in town from Virginia Street. When I lived there, there was a guy we called the Waving Man. And every morning, the Waving Man would walk down Virginia Street waving and smiling at everybody on the road. And in the afternoon, he'd come back the other way, waving and smiling at everybody. We all thought he was absolutely nuts. But you know what? You smiled and you waved back at him. And one day I was getting gas on Virginia Street and Waving Man started walking by. And I said, I got to go talk to this guy to find out if he's nice or nuts. And I walked over and I said, hey, Waving Man, how you doing? He said, well, my name's Bob. You can call me Bob if you want. I said, hey, Bob, I have a question for you. How come you're doing this Waving Man thing? He said, well, a few years back, I was noticing that everybody in Reno was cranky. And he said, I would walk around my neighborhood and people were just cranky, so I started waving and smiling. And I discovered that when I waved and smiled, they waved and smiled back. And a few years later, I retired, and I decided that God was calling me to make Reno a happier place. And the best place to do that was on Virginia Street. So I started every day walking in the morning one way down Virginia Street, waving and smiling at everybody, and then in the afternoon I'd walk back down the other way, waving and smiling. And he said, you know what? Reno is a happier place now. Not quite so crazy, is he? Now, I'm not expecting Elliot to be up and down here on Spring Hill Drive in Mariner and 19 waving at everybody. Be an original. Figure out what God's calling you to do. Figure out how you can bring joy into other people's life. And when you do, all of these fruits of the Spirit will start naturally coming out of you. You'll discover that you're much more loving and joyful and peaceful and patient and kind and gentle and faithful and self-controlled and good. These are natural expressions of living out your calling. I hope that you find your calling, because you will never experience joy until you do.